So you've been quite busy as of late, which has obviously resulted in delays in meeting to record. But I want to highlight what you've been busy doing because it's quite a big deal. You've had your name in the papers and your face on national television.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So, I essentially ran my first marathon at the end of April. The run up to my marathon, I got reached out to by multiple news outlets, one of them being pretty big, the BBC, the BBC Manchester. So a journalist came over to my house and did some filming, and then that aired on BBC, and then some Lad Bible, which is quite famous online, and then some radio stuff, and a magazine reached out to me as well. Kind of the whole point was about my journey from kind of homelessness and hopelessness to hopefulness and losing 10 stone, getting myself out of that rut and changing my life around. And the marathon being kind of the latest addition to my long list of challenges that I wanted to do, to be able to prove to myself, most importantly, but obviously to others as well, that I am capable of hard things, and hopefully somebody else sees the story and thinks I'm going to do something similar. That was kind of the whole thing, really.
Definitely something to look up to. I feel quite inspired myself because I over the years have gone from someone who would uh, run twice a day and work out twice a day to someone who is unfortunately affected by a 9 to 5, and sitting at a desk 8 hours a day really takes a toll on the human body. So yeah, you've not just inspired countless individuals, you've also inspired me, your co-host.
That's great, man. That's great. Thanks, man. I hope you take something from it, or anyone who sees it. I hope you take something from it. And the main thing is not to be comparative. Like, you don't have to do a marathon, but it's just about showing people that they can do things if they want to. As in, like, you have the power, you have the ability, and people shouldn't be so self-deprecating. So that I've taken the route of kind of going onto social media and talking more about that, the health and well-being space of it, the nutrition side of it, because a lot of people have asked, this the same way that I apply myself to research for Sumerian and Mesopotamian history. I apply that to nutrition as well, and exercise and things like that. So I have a lot of knowledge on that as well. So I'm going to kind of transfer that knowledge onto other people, for those of people that are interested, and kind of take it from there, really, and see where it goes. Who knows?
All right, and action. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the latest episode of Ancient Near East Meets Modern West. I'm your host, Samuel David,
And I'm the co-host, Jake Baxter,
and today we are going to be talking about the Mesopotamian scribal schools.
also known as the E-Dubba.
So, when we talk about the E-Dubba, or the tablet house, that was the scribal school of ancient Mesopotamia, whether that would be in occupied Sumer, in Babylon, in Akkad, in Assyria. And these were essentially institutions where young boys, primarily from elite families, were sent to become scribes. And these institutions did play a crucial role in preserving and transmitting Mesopotamian culture, literature, legal systems, and administrative practices.
There was a need for schools, and that need arose out of course, the invention of writing, in the Uruk period, with the increase in kind of trade and production of irrigation and farming and things like that. There was an increase, of course, of demand, and then the increase of need to document that demand, to record keep. So that's where we get the birth of school. That's why it started. That's how it started, and then it starts to develop into the kind of the text that we think of today. You know, the ritualistic texts, the liturgical, the incantation, and of course the narrative, the Epic of Gilgamesh being like probably the most famous, the Enuma Elish, and things of that nature. So yeah, that's where we get, the birth of the scribal school.
And on top of that, with regards to those in attendance, we do have extensive records of nobles such as Gilgamesh. We also have Shulgi, who you are quite the fan of, and he is well known for a particular tablet that's labeled as Shulgi B.
Correct. I am a little bit of a fanboy of Shulgi, I must say. And for those of you that don't know who Shulgi is, he was the son of Ornamu, who was the founder of the Sumerian Renaissance period, the Ur-3 period, as we call it, which is basically where Sumer was originally kind of taken over by the Akkadian usurpers, if you like. And with that came in the Akkadian language. It became the dominant language from the north to the south, with Sargon of Akkad, most famously. The reason I like Shulgi is it's because during his reign, his period, that we start to get a plethora of Sumerian kind of texts, or at least the later texts that venerate him, have that kind of that really intrinsic and important poetry pattern that we know so well in Sumerian poetry, the repetition, So, for example, in the praise poem Shulgi or Shulgi B, one of the versions of the praise poems, we have the phrase "I am," like littered all the way through it. I am, or I was born to be a mighty man, or I am, I was endowed with wisdom by the god Enki. I am attractive. I am the attractive one. Kind of chosen by Inanna or that kind of thing. But that's really important to the conversation that we're having today, because the repetition and the use of the same language throughout those poems was what gave the scribal students of the time a way in of learning Sumerian. It was kind of a fairly short poem, if you like, maybe, I don't know, 100 lines or maybe 150 lines or something, if that. And a lot of it was quite repetitive. So it was the good intro to Sumerian, if you like, for the scribe. Which brings me on to my next point, that the learning material that they would use one of them was called the Akkad, which is a series of 10 texts, Shulgi B being the first one, I believe. And that was used as a pedagogical tool for learning Sumerian grammar, essentially, giving you a taste of what Sumerian sounds like, what it looks like, how it's formed, its sentence structure, its verbal structures, everything that makes it beautifully difficult, especially as a modern kind of translator, if you like, or scribe. So I think that's what more gets me about Shulgi. It's not necessarily him, because I imagine that he was no different to any other king at the time. But well, he did have, he was quite powerful. But I mean, for me,
Well, not only was he quite powerful, but he was also um, quite florid with his writing style.
in the south, in Urim, I caused a house of the wisdom of Nisaba to spring up in sacrosanct ground for the writing of my hymns. Up country in Nippur, I established another. May the scribe be on duty there and transcribe with his hand the prayers which I instituted in the Acor, Enlil's temple. And may the singer perform, reciting from the text. The academies are never to be altered. The places of learning shall never cease to exist. Beautiful. So it's this. This is the writing style that I'm talking about. This is why I love it so much. Is because not only are we getting a view into the Sumerian style of writing in terms of how it's formed, the grammar, the linguistic side of it, but we're also getting a kind of a, a brief glimpse into the time, Shulgi, and he was basically saying he established the first schools essentially, or I'm sure he would say it was the first school, but that's what he's doing. He's saying, Nisaba being the goddess, the scribal goddess of the time, the Sumerian god of writing, and grain, I believe, was being kind of, Shulgi liked to say that the gods did this for him. It's because of under Nisaba that I have raised the houses of wisdom, these scribal schools, and we see that kind of motif throughout all of his writings. And I don't know, flawed. The Akkad, which I mentioned, which was the 10 pedagogical tablets used for teaching the Sumerian language. We don't just get Shulgi and his, unending glory. We also get one of the early Gilgamesh tales as well.
You can definitely tell, especially when comparing all of these tablets that utilize the Akkad, that there are variations throughout the entire theme, and with these variations come a lot of inconsistencies. So trying to reconcile the corpus of the epic requires us to pick and choose from various sources, whether that would be during one period or the other, or from one scribal school to the next. So we're dealing with a civilization here. For those who are not familiar, we're dealing with the civilization here who left us a considerable number of examples of their literature, of their liturgical texts, their administrative texts. But it's not consistent. There's nothing that's static throughout time. Things change, things evolve, and it's inevitable when we look at these texts. So when we look at the historical practices, we look at how the E-Dubba was structured, its hierarchy. We'll have to start from the beginning. So the E-Dubba was primarily attached to temples or palaces, but there were some that did operate independently. And one of the most famous examples of a scribal center that operated independently was found in Nippur, and that was the chief city that was ruled by the god Enlil. A typical E-Dubba or scribal school was a small mud brick building with benches for students and storage areas for clay. And in larger cities, these buildings may have been more elaborate with multiple rooms for different levels of instruction. And it was not just a school, but also a community with its own hierarchy. So we have the expert teacher, who is the headmaster that's responsible for overseeing education and maintaining discipline. We have the senior scribe, who consisted of advanced scribes who assisted in instruction and lesson plans. Then we have the junior scribes, who were less experienced, often acting as teaching assistants. Then we have the scholars, who were high-ranking scribes that specialized in advanced topics such as astronomy, medicine, legal texts, liturgy, and even mythology. And then, of course, we have the students, boys from elite families, typically starting their education between the ages of 6 or 7.
The reason we know that, or the reason we have an idea as to how young people were when they started the E-Dubba, was because of the famous tablet with a little bite mark in it. I believe there was DNA testing done on that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You can obviously tell within the context of that tablet and that bite mark that somebody did not want to do their homework or did not want to follow the instructions of their scribal elder. So it's either bite the clay or stomp out of class.
They left behind us enough information to basically reconstruct what a day would look like, and kind of their curriculum too. So their curriculum was not too dissimilar, dare I say, to kind of what we did. Like vowels and maths to a degree. The sciences again to a degree. So yeah, it really wasn't too dissimilar to what we kind of teach now, I suppose. Just maybe obviously a different level and a different societal context. But I think the amount of stuff that they left behind was aided in the material that they used. The clay itself is obviously durable once it's baked as well. And that's what thankfully, gave us a way of, of being able to decipher and rebuild, like you said, not just the curriculum and all this, the ins and outs, but what it, the remnants of what it looked like was obviously made out of clay as well. And how important, of course, the scribal art was to religious practice as well. Like you mentioned, how it was attached to the temple, which was no doubt seen as like an important thing when writing prayers and incantations and things of that nature and all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about probably the most famous period, I would argue, in this conversation. And I would say that would be the Old Babylonian period.
What we find during that period of time is the majority of the texts that we know today that are composed in Sumerian were not original to the Sumerian people. The Sumerian language was considered a lingua franca, so it was utilized for important texts. And what better way to capture the glory and majesty of your cultural forebears than to elevate Sumerian to that status and not just compose your day-to-day transactions in temples and in trade, but also to capture the Sumerian script or the Sumerian language for all time. And as we find in history, the use of Sumerian was actually a practice until the 2nd century CE. So it did have longevity. It may not have been spoken for a particular period of time, but during that Renaissance, during the third dynasty of Ur, where we see this Renaissance in the Sumerian language, we also see that continued through the Old Babylonian period.
As you said, the reason being the Sumerian being such a revered language, even if we go back to the Akkadian period that we mentioned earlier, which obviously was the end of the early dynastic, the early Sumerians, the OGs that were kind of usurped by the Akkadians. Even Enheduanna famously utilized Sumerian as well as Akkadian in her, famous poems, the hymn to Inanna, and and things of that nature. The Exaltation, as we call the other one, was written in Sumerian, which I believe was a political kind of tool to appeal to the people in the south who didn't take well. They didn't take well to Solomon and his customs, so that was a way of bringing them on board, so to speak.
Right. Not just to smooth societal tensions, but also to smooth religious and temple tensions, because you have the Akkadian peoples that are essentially not just conquering, but also they've colonized the region, they've conquered the region, and the Sumerian peoples and their existing practices are being assimilated into the practices and the population of the Akkadian people until a point where the Sumerians altogether disappear from the historical record as a distinct people.
Absolutely. And, Scribal, kind of going back to the whole scribe topic as well, and Sumerian as well. Like a notable example of how long it was venerated that I like is of course King Ashurbanipal's library, where he boasts that he can understand complex Sumerian, and obviously has Sumerian text within his library. So even even those much later kings in the towards the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, we have Sumerian being kind of venerated, and there being references to Sumerian kings or kind of ideas. So yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that the Sumerian language, in itself has even though the people died, as you said, is that the people kind of died out as a distinct group of people, their culture and identity and religious ideas through the text, through the language itself, lived on thousands and thousands of years after they had departed. So, did they really disappear?
Ancient alien theorists suggest.
Oh, get out. What would a scribe who graduated from the E-Dubba, if you like, and went into the temples to work, including people who worked for like Ashurbanipal much later on, what life would they see? What could they expect as a scribe?
That's an interesting question. So, when we look at the career opportunities for scribes, many scribes were employed in temples, as we just said, and in that day-to-day life, they would be responsible for managing sacred texts. They themselves would conduct religious ceremonies to an extent, and they would also record economic transactions that were related to the temple, whether that would be the physical temple building itself or the properties owned by the temple, and from those properties, the various offerings that were received, whether that would be grain offerings or offerings in the form of livestock. And what's interesting is the temple scribes often worked closely with priests and did play a role in preserving hymns, myths, and omens. And some were also involved in scholarly fields such as astronomy. And when I mention astronomy, I'm also including astrology, but not in the modern sense. So astronomy, astrology were very intertwined. They were actually considered a form of wisdom that was imparted by the lunar deity Nana or Sin. In addition to these texts, they were also responsible for recording information concerning medicine, the practice of medicine, as well as formularies for various ingredients in unguents or other substances for medicinal use. And of course, they also recorded divination, and that pretty much put them in a key position within the temple, and not just in the temple itself, but it also made them key figures in the overall intellectual life of various civilizations within the region of Mesopotamia. In fact, going back to the the region of Nippur that I had mentioned, the Temple of Enlil in Nippur housed a vast collection of texts, and these were all copied and maintained by temple scribes. And some of these scribes even used their divinatory practices as well as the interpretation of omens and celestial movements of planets or stars to advise rulers and even priests within their own temple.
I would argue definitely that the scribes were seen, especially high-end scribes, were seen as sort of divinely inspired. There's a lot of references to being endowed with wisdom. Those who could write, I think there's one poem that mentions having like a gold stylus or something.
A gold stylus, yeah, yeah.
So it's seen as like a powerful tool in itself, the art of writing. And Ashurbanipal himself, who I mentioned, arguably the greatest king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, had in his reliefs the styluses tucked into his kind of, his get-up, his regalia, tucked in there as a symbol of his scholarly abilities, his writing abilities. One thing I wanted to touch on, Sam, is something that you mentioned earlier, which completely slipped my mind. I'm really glad you mentioned it. Was the proverbs that we get from the Babylonian schools. Again, a lot of these, dare I say, if not all of them are from the OB or the Old Babylonian period around 1900 BCE, 2000 to 1900 BCE, roughly, starting in that period and lasting, I think it's the 1600 BCE. But what we see here as well is we're starting to see, like you said, a bit more of the mindset of how they viewed the arts, but also how they viewed life as well. Like, people often reference, including myself, the famous passage from Gilgamesh where it's like, where are you hurrying to, Gilgamesh? The gods have placed upon man death, and for them kept life in their own keeping, kind of thing. That sentiment of living your own life and stuff. But we see lots more of that in proverb text or proverbial text. One of my favorite proverbs, which is on the CDLI to view. I actually did a video on my YouTube channel about this as well.
So today I'm going to show you an ancient Sumerian proverb tablet and break down the language for you. This tablet is dated to the Old Babylonian period and is currently kept in the Royal Ontario Museum of Archaeology. Stay till the end of the video to see my version of this tablet. Ningshunyalani, Ibigin, Anshe Ba'ede. So first off we have the word Ningshunyal, which means goods or possessions. This word is made up of the word Ning, which means something or a thing, Shu, which can mean hand, and Nyal, which can have the meaning to have. So quite literally you could translate this as something that the hand has, or possessions. Attached to this word is Lani. So this is the possessive case marker Ani, meaning his or hers, and L is being carried over from the previous sign. This is known as the Auslaut. Line 2 is nice and simple. We have the word Ibi, meaning smoke, and the equative case marker Gin, which means like or as. So we have like smoke. Finally, we have Anshe Ba'ede. So Anshe is the nominal chain, and this means to the sky or to heaven. She is the terminative case marker, meaning motion towards something. The noun An can mean a few different things, such as sky or heaven, or making reference to the sky god himself, but here it takes the meaning sky or heaven. Now finally, onto the verbal chain, Ba'ede. Now there are two ways that I looked at this when translating. So first off, ba is a prefix which is typically associated with an intransitive verb. Intransitive meaning it doesn't directly affect something. And ba is also associated with inanimate subjects of the verb. Inanimate in Sumerian is something that isn't a person or a god. The de is forming the verb ed3, which means to ascend. E from the first sign and the D from the next is what I believe is forming ed3. If we were to normalise this transliteration, we would get ed-e. The remaining E left over is marking the maru, which is the present/future, or more accurately, the ongoing tense, making this sentence say, will ascend to the sky, or to heaven. Or secondly, the E3, which is also just another form of the verb to ascend, and the next sign, day 3, is simply there to form the Maru E marker. Either way, you get will ascend to the sky/heaven, making the full translation, his possessions, like smoke, will ascend to the sky. Here is my rendition of the same proverb tablet.
And that's my favorite Sumerian proverb. And then there's loads of other things as well, which tell us or give us a glimpse into how people at the time thought. But my point is it undoes a lot of the kind of presuppositions modern people have about ancient cultures, that they're kind of archaic or silly, or I'm trying to think of the word, but you get my point. These texts as well, just on their own, these proverbs, give us a glimpse, into to reaffirming that they were just like us. They thought the same, they did the same things, they laughed at the same things. I'm pretty sure there's fart jokes in Sumerian. Like they weren't very much the same as we are. Like they weren't kind of, silly, if you like. And
Yeah,
that's
they
what I love.
definitely love their toilet humor. I will
Oh,
say
they do.
that.
They do. And that's what I love about the reading these proverb tablets, which, by the way, for anyone listening, you can look at them on the electronic corpus of Sumerian literature online, put together by Oxford, and there is also the CDLI, or the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, which you can actually see some of these tablets as well, these pictures of the tablets themselves, and a lot of the proverb tablets as well tend to be circular, which is how I do a lot of my tablets. And there does seem to be a correlation in the shape as well, in terms of what content it's going to be. So, like, if it's a really small square tablet, it's probably going to be an administrative tablet. And if it's like a bigger, more square tablet, it's potentially going to be more of a mythological or liturgical text. So that's an interesting point as well. So a question I've got for you, Sam, is what do we know, if anything, about female scribes?
We have several cuneiform texts from different periods that reference female scribes as Munus Dubsar, which in Sumerian means female scribe. And it did suggest that women did receive training in writing, and these are referenced in administrative records, temple documents, personal letters, and in personal seals. So during the Old Babylonian period, texts explicitly mention women writing as scribes, particularly in these temple contexts. And in Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, women with scribal skills appear in records that were related to royal courts and priestesses. And if we look at the seals from the Ur 3 period between 2100 to 2004 BCE, we have names of women with administrative titles. And with these titles comes an education to back up that title.
Just to add to that as well, Sam, I'm pretty sure as well in Sumerian we have a whole dialect written for women, which is the Emisal dialect, which means thin tongue or fine tongue.
Which is interesting because not only was it utilized by women in speech and writing, it's also utilized in temple work. Excuse me. It's also utilized by members of specific temples, most notably the temples dedicated to Inanna, where male priests or individuals who were considered gender liminal or gender non-conforming spoke in this particular dialect.
And I believe I remember reading in Eckhart Fromm's book about Assyria, in one of the, I think, the earlier Assyrian periods, there was letters, kind of off the back of what you said about letters, about women who were essentially on their own because their husbands were out trading in Anatolia, which was obviously common in Assyria. They would, the husbands would be trading in Anatolia, so the women would be on their own essentially. And I think there's a lot of letters from women who were basically lonely and kind of angry that their husbands have spent so long in Anatolia trading and left them on their Todd. So
yeah. One thing that I find interesting is typically these letters are complaint letters. I wrote you have not responded, or when you left, you did not provide me with X number of goods or a particular sum of currency, or you didn't leave me with the necessary resources to run the households.
I think in Benjamin Foster's book, the Akkadian text, there's some things in there. There's one about I can't attest as to whether it was written by a female scribe, but there's one that talks about a miscarriage, and it mentions crying to Nintud, or the lady of birth, and saying why essentially, like, this child's been taken away from me. It's like an elegy to I forgot what it's called now. Sophus Hele posted it as well.
Mhm.
But it mentions, about basically a miscarriage. So that's potentially a female scribe as well.
As Mesopotamian city-states expanded, particularly under the Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian empires, we find that their reach not just included Mesopotamia, but also included regions adjacent to the Mesopotamian Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. So we find scribes coming in from other cultures, Assyrian merchant colonies in Anatolia. We also have Elamite and Aramaic scribes. And what's interesting is we also have the Amarna letters with correspondences between Egyptian pharaohs and Mesopotamian rulers. We also have the scribes that come from Hittite and Ugaritic cultures in the Levant, and more noticeably, as Babylon falls to Persia, we have Persian scribes coming in who were skilled in Elamite, Akkadian, and Old Persian cuneiform. And when we take this even further, there is evidence of Greek scribes in the region, particularly during the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great's conquest, and as the region became part of the Seleucid Empire, where Greek becomes an administrative and scholarly language alongside Akkadian and Aramaic. We have one notable individual by the name of Berosus, who was actually a Greek-born priest of Marduk. So that's an individual that I find incredibly fascinating. In fact, I don't want to say codified mythology, but he did present the mythology of Babylon to a Greek audience using Greek terms, Greek deities, and um, Greek cultural motifs.
It's really interesting, sort of to wrap up the whole conversation. What I think is really interesting is we've gone from, the early dynastic period, the Uruk period, early dynastic period, those early periods in southern Mesopotamia, being the birth of writing, and then of course the birth of the scribal tradition and how it became associated with divinity and wisdom and knowledge, divinely inspired, of course. To fast forward going down into the courts, like you said, of Egyptians and kind of the whole, the ancient world in that area, using the writing of Babylonians, the Akkadian language, as a kind of diplomatic language, that everybody kind of, I assume, knew in the courts at least, and things like that, all the way to modern day. Now we're writing, and we're digitally writing, and it's just, I think it's absolutely fascinating that we're talking about the birth of writing and the birth of teaching writing to here we are now, where you don't even have to write anymore. You can speak into a phone if you want, and it writes on the screen for you. It's just,
Right.
I think it's absolutely, it just it puts it into perspective, doesn't it, where it all began. And
Yeah,
like
it really does. And it really shows, I feel, not just I think, but I really feel that as we see intellectualism being denigrated and literacy rates among adults specifically dropping, the ancient peoples who developed these writing systems would look to the future, look to us now with, our tablets, our phones, that we're able to write. We have the knowledge of the ages at our disposal, and they would envy that, I think. And we often take for granted these advances that we have, the access to libraries, the access to the internet. We live in an age of information, but unfortunately we also must contend with disinformation and misinformation.
I agree. And I think what's like really spiritual to me, and just mind-boggling, kind of on the point that I raised, was Like, for example, there's a library that's close to me, the John Rylands in Manchester, which is quite famous for its Gothic architecture. Is when I go and visit tablets in there, in that, I'm sat in a library full of books, of course, looking at the oldest writings, the oldest words among some of the newer words and books, and I just think it's unbelievably like I can't explain the feeling, but it's like Ashurbanipal was doing the same thing. He was in his library looking at texts that were thousands of years old to him.
Right.
And here I am doing the same thing thousands of years later. It's just crazy. I don't know. It's pretty cool, to be honest.
With all the modern conveniences that would just blow their minds.
Oh yeah, well yeah, like things that would send Sumerians into a coma.
I feel that we've barely scratched the surface on this subject because it's so dense and it covers thousands of years, literally thousands of years, from the evolution of Sumerian as a means to record, transactions, small transactions, to, the use of cuneiform text to compose laws and court documents. So yeah, this is barely even a survey, and I really want to dig into the weeds with this.
And anyone who's watching or listening, I would implore you to go on to the Electronic Corpus of Sumerian Literature and the CDLI, or the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, and have a look at some of these texts that we talked about, the proverb tablets and things of that nature, because you really don't understand, or appreciate rather, the kind of breadth of knowledge and time, until you start reading these texts for yourself. So